we shall begin with True Relation of the Apparition of One Mrs. Veal by Daniel Defoe. This thing is so rare in all its circumstances, and on so good authority, that my reading and conversation have not given me anything like it. It is fit to gratify the most ingenious and serious inquirer. Mrs. Bargrave is the person to whom Mrs. Veal appeared after her death. She is my intimate friend, and I can avouch for her reputation for these 15 or 16 years on my own knowledge, and I can affirm the good character she had from her youth to the time of my acquaintance. Though, since this relation, she is calumniated by some people that are friends to the brother of Mrs. Veal, who appeared to think the relation of this appearance to be a reflection, and endeavour what they can to blast Mrs. Bargrave's reputation and to laugh the story out of countenance. But by the circumstances thereof, and the cheerful disposition of Mrs. Bargrave, notwithstanding the ill usage of a very wicked husband, there is not yet the least sign of dejection in her face. Nor did I ever hear her let fall a desponding or murmuring expression. Nay, not when actually under her husband's barbarity, which I have been a witness to, and several other persons of undoubted reputation. Now, you must know, Mrs. Veal was a maiden gentlewoman of about 30 years of age, and for some years past had been troubled with fits, which were perceived coming on her by her going off from her discourse very abruptly to some impertinence. She was maintained by an only brother, and kept his house in Dover. She was a very pious woman, and her brother a very sober man, to all appearance, but now he does all he can to null and quash the story. Mrs. Veal was intimately acquainted with Mrs. Bargrave from her childhood. Mrs. Veal's circumstances were then mean. Her father did not take care of his children as he ought, so that they were exposed to hardships. And Mrs. Bargrave in those days had as unkind a father, though she wanted neither for food nor clothing, while Mrs. Veal wanted for both, insomuch that she would often say, "Mrs. Bargrave, you are not only the best, but the only friend I have in the world, and no circumstance of life shall ever dissolve my friendship." They would often condole each other's adverse fortunes, and read together Drelincourt upon Death, and other books, and so, like two Christian friends, they comforted each other under their sorrow. Some time after, Mr. Veal's friends got him a place in the custom-house at Dover, which occasioned Mrs. Veal, by little and little, to fall off from her intimacy with Mrs. Bargrave, though there was never any such thing as a quarrel, but an indifferency came on by degrees, till at last Mrs. Bargrave had not seen her in 2 years and a half, though above a 12-month of the time Mrs. Bargrave hath been absent from Dover, and this last half-year has been in Canterbury about 2 months of the time, dwelling in a house of her own. In this house, in the 8th of September 1705, she was sitting alone in the forenoon, thinking over her unfortunate life, and arguing herself into a due resignation to Providence, though her condition seemed hard. "And," said she, "I have been provided for hitherto, and doubt not but I shall be still, and am well satisfied that my afflictions shall end when it is most fit for me." And then took up her sewing work, which she had no sooner done, but she hears a knocking at the door. She went to see who was there, and this proved to be Mrs. Veal, her old friend, who was in a riding habit. At that moment of time the clock struck 12 at noon. "Madam," says Mrs. Bargrave, "I am surprised to see you, you who have been so long a stranger," but told her she was glad to see her, and offered to salute her, which Mrs. Veal complied with, till their lips almost touched, and then Mrs. Veal drew her hand across her own eyes and said, "I am not very well," and so waved it. She told Mrs. Bargrave she was going on a journey, and had a great mind to see her first. "But," said Mrs. Bargrave, how can you take a journey alone? I am amazed at it, because I know you have a fond brother." "Oh," says Mrs. Veal, "I gave my brother the slip, and came away, because I had so great a desire to see you before I took my journey." So Mrs. Bargrave went in with her into another room within the first, and Mrs. Veal sat her down in an elbow chair, in which Mrs. Bargrave was sitting when she heard Mrs. Veal knock. "Then," says Mrs. Veal, "my dear friend, I am come to renew our old friendship again, and beg your pardon for my breach of it, and if you can forgive me, you are the best of women." "Oh," says Mrs. Bargrave, "do not mention such a thing. I have not had an uneasy thought about it." "What did you think of me?" says Mrs. Veal. Says Mrs. Bargrave, "I thought you were like the rest of the world, and that prosperity had made you forget yourself and me." Then Mrs. Veal reminded Mrs. Bargrave of the many friendly offices she did her in former days, and much of the conversation they had with each other in the times of their adversity, what books they read, and what comfort in particular they received from Drelincourt's Book of Death, which was the best, she said, on the subject ever wrote. She also mentioned Dr. Sherlock and 2 Dutch books, which were translated, wrote upon death, and several others. But Drelincourt, she said, had the clearest notions of death and of the future state of any who had handled that subject. Then she asked Mrs. Bargrave whether she had Drelincourt. She said, yes. Says Mrs. Veal, "Fetch it." And so Mrs. Bargrave goes upstairs and brings it down. Says Mrs. Veal, "Dear Mrs. Bargrave, if the eyes of our faith were as open as the eyes of our body, we should see numbers of angels about us for our guard. The notions we have of heaven now are nothing like what it is, as Drelincourt says. Therefore be comforted under your afflictions, and believe that the Almighty has a particular regard to you, and that your afflictions are marks of God's favour, and when they have done the business they are sent for, they shall be and when they have done the business they are sent for, they shall be removed from you. And believe me, my dear friend, believe what I say to you. 1 minute of future happiness will infinitely reward you for all your sufferings. For I can never believe," and claps her hand upon her knee with great earnestness, which indeed ran through most of her discourse, "that ever God will suffer you to spend all your days in this afflicted state. But be assured that your afflictions shall leave you, or you them, in a short time." She spake in that pathetical and heavenly manner that Mrs. Bargrave wept several times, she was so deeply affected with it. Then Mrs. Veal mentioned Dr. Kendrick's Ascetic, at the end of which he gives an account of the lives of the primitive Christians. Their pattern she recommended to our imitation, and said, "Their conversation was not like this of our age. For now," says she, "there is nothing but vain, frothy discourse, which is far different from theirs. Theirs was to edification, and to build one another up in faith, so that they were not as we are, nor are we as they were. But," said she, "we ought to do as they did. There was a hearty friendship among them, but where is it now to be found?" Says Mrs. Bargrave, "It hard is indeed to find a true friend in these days." Says Mrs. Veal, "Mrs. Norris has a fine copy of verses called Friendship in Perfection, which I wonderfully admire." "Have you seen the book?" Says Mrs. Veal, "No." Says Mrs. Bargrave, "But I have the verses of my own writing out." "Have you?" says Mrs. Veal, "then fetch them." Which she did from above stairs, and offered them to Mrs. Veal to read, who refused, and waved the thing, saying, holding down her head would make it ache, and then desiring Mrs. Bargrave to read them to her, which she did. As they were admiring friendship, Mrs. Veal said, Dear Mrs. Bargrave, I shall love you for ever. In these verses there is twice used the word Elysian. Ah, says Mrs. Veal, these poets have such names for heaven. She would often draw her hand across her own eyes and say, Mrs. Bargrave, do not you think I am mightily impaired by my fits? No, says Mrs. Bargrave, I think you look as well as ever I knew you. After this discourse, which the apparition put in much finer words than Mrs. Bargrave said she could pretend to, and as much more as she can remember, for it cannot be thought that an hour and 3/4 conversation could all be retained, though the main of it she thinks she does, she said to Mrs. Bargrave she would have her write a letter to her brother, and tell him she would have him give rings to such and such, and that there was a purse of gold in her cabinet, and that she would have 2 broad pieces given to her cousin Watson. Talking at this rate, Mrs. Bargrave thought that a fit was coming upon her, and so placed herself on a chair just before her knees to keep her from falling to the ground, if her fits should occasion it, for the elbow chair, she thought, would keep her from falling on either side. And to divert Mrs. Veal, as she thought, took hold of her gown sleeve several times and commended it. Mrs. Veal told her it was a scarred silk and newly made up. But for all this, Mrs. Veal persisted in her request, and told Mrs. Bargrave she must not deny her. And she would have her tell her brother all their conversation when she had the opportunity. Dear Mrs. Veal, said Mrs. Bargrave, it is much better, methinks, to do it yourself. No, says Mrs. Veal, though it seems impertinent to you now, you will see more reasons for it hereafter. Mrs. Bargrave then, to satisfy her importunity, was going to fetch a pen and ink, but Mrs. Veal said, Let it alone now, but do it when I am gone. But you must be sure to do it. Which was one of the last things she enjoined at her parting, and so she promised her. Then Mrs. Veal asked for Mrs. Bargrave's daughter. She said she was not at home. But if you have a mind to see her, says Mrs. Bargrave, I'll send for her. Do, says Mrs. Veal, on which she left her and went to a neighbour's to see her, and by the time Mrs. Bargrave was returning, Mrs. Veal was without the door in the street, in the face of the beast market, on a Saturday, which is market day, and stood ready to part as soon as Mrs. Bargrave came to her. She asked her why she was in such haste. She said she must be going, though perhaps she might not go her journey till Monday, and told Mrs. Bargrave she hoped she should see her again at her cousin Watson's before she went whither she was going. Then she said she would take her leave of her, and walked from Mrs. Bargrave in her view till a turning interrupted the sight of her, which was 1:75 in the afternoon. Mrs. Veal died the 7th of September at 12 o'clock at noon of her fits, and had not above 4 hours' senses before her death, in which time she received the sacrament. The next day after Mrs. Veal's appearance, being Sunday, Mrs. Bargrave was mightily indisposed with a cold and sore throat, that she could not go out that day. But on Monday morning she sends a person to Captain Watson's to know if Mrs. Veal was there. They wondered at Mrs. Bargrave's inquiry, and sent her word she was not there, nor was expected. At this answer, Mrs. Bargrave told the maid she had certainly mistook the name or made some blunder. And though she was ill, she put on her hood and went herself to Captain Watson's, though she knew none of the family, to see if Mrs. Veal was there or not. They said they wondered at her asking, for that she had not been in town, they were sure. If she had, she would have been there. Says Mr. Bargrave, I am sure she was with me on Saturday almost 2 hours. They said it was impossible, for they must have seen her if she had. In comes Captain Watson while they were in dispute, and said that Mrs. Veal was certainly dead, and the Ushans were making. This strangely surprised Mrs. Bargrave when she sent to the person immediately who had the care of them, and found it true. Then she related the whole story to Captain Watson's family, what gown she had on, and how striped, and that Mrs. Veal told her that it was scarred. Then Mrs. Watson cried out, "You have seen her indeed, for none knew but Mrs. Veal and myself that the gown was scoured." And Mrs. Watson owned that she described the gown exactly. "For," said she, "I helped her to make it up." This Mrs. Watson blazed all about the town, and avouched the demonstration of truth of Mrs. Bargrave's seeing Mrs. Veal's apparition. And Captain Watson carried 2 gentlemen immediately to Mrs. Bargrave's house to hear the relation from her own mouth. And when it spread so fast that gentlemen and persons of quality, the judicious and sceptical part of the world, flocked in upon her, it at last became such a task that she was forced to go out of the way, for they were in general extremely satisfied of the truth of the thing, and plainly saw that Mrs. Bargrave was no hypochondriac, for she always appears with such a cheerful air and pleasing mien that she has gained the favour and esteem of all the gentry. And it is thought a great favour if they can but get the relation from her own mouth. I should have told you before that Mrs. Veal told Mrs. Bargrave that her sister and brother-in-law were just come down from London to see her. Says Mrs. Bargrave, "How came you to order matters so strangely?" "It could not be helped," said Mrs. Veal. And her brother and sister did come to see her, and entered the town of Dover just as Mrs. Veal was expiring. Mrs. Bargrave asked her whether she would drink some tea. Says Mrs. Veal, "I do not care if I do, but I'll warrant you this mad fellow," meaning Mrs. Bargrave's husband, "has broke all your trinkets." "But," says Mrs. Bargrave, "I'll get something to drink in for all that." But Mrs. Veal waved it, and said, "It is no matter, let it alone." And so it passed. All the time I sat with Mrs. Bargrave, which was some hours, she recollected fresh sayings of Mrs. Veal. And one material thing more she told Mrs. Bargrave, that old Mr. Breton allowed Mrs. Veal £10 a year, which was a secret and unknown to Mrs. Bargrave till Mrs. Veal told her. Mrs. Bargrave never varies in her story, which puzzles those in doubt of the truth, or who are unwilling to believe it. A servant in the neighbour's yard adjoining to Mrs. Bargrave's house heard her talking to somebody an hour of the time Mrs. Veal was with her. Mrs. Bargrave went out to her next neighbour's the very moment she parted with Mrs. Veal, and told her what ravishing conversation she had with an old friend, and told the whole of it. Drelincourt's Book of Death is, since this happened, brought up strangely, and it is to be observed that, notwithstanding all the trouble and fatigue Mrs. Bargrave has undergone upon this account, she never took the value of a farthing, nor suffered her daughter to take anything of anybody, and therefore can have no interest in telling the story. But Mr. Veal does what he can to stifle the matter, and said he would see Mrs. Bargrave, but yet it is certain matter of fact that he has been at Captain Watson's since the death of his sister, and yet never went near Mrs. Bargrave. And some of his friends report her to be a liar, and that she knew of Mr. Breton's £10 a year. But the person who pretends to say so has the reputation to be a notorious liar among persons whom I know to be of undoubted credit. Now, Mr. Veal is more of a gentleman than to say she lies, but says a bad husband has crazed her. But she needs only present herself, and it will effectually confute that pretence. Mr. Veal says he asked his sister on her deathbed whether she had a mind to dispose of anything, and she said no. Now the things which Mrs. Veal's apparition would have disposed of were so trifling, and nothing of justice aimed at in her disposal, that the design of it appears to me to be only in order to make Mrs. Bargrave satisfy the world of the reality thereof as to what she had seen and heard, and to secure her reputation among the reasonable and understanding part of mankind. And then again, Mr. Veal owns that there was a purse of gold, but it was not found in her cabinet, but in a comb-box. This looks improbable, for that Mrs. Watson owned that Mrs. Veal was so very careful of the key of her cabinet that she would trust nobody with it, and if so, no doubt she would not trust her gold out of it. And Mrs. Veal's often drawing her hands over her eyes and asking Mrs. Bargrave whether her fits had not impaired her, looks to me as if she did it on purpose, to remind Mrs. Bargrave of her fits, to prepare her not to think it strange that she should put her upon writing to her brother, to dispose of rings and gold, which looks so much like a dying person's bequest. And it took accordingly with Mrs. Bargrave as the effect of her fits coming upon her, and was one of the many instances of her wonderful love to her and care of her, that she should not be affrighted, which indeed appears in her whole management, particularly in her coming to her in the daytime, waving the salutation, and when she was alone, and then the manner of her parting, to prevent a second attempt to salute her. Now, why Mr. Veal should think this relation a reflection, as it is plain he does, by his endeavouring to stifle it, I cannot imagine, because the generality believe her to be a good spirit, her discourse was so heavenly. Her two great errands were to comfort Mrs. Bargrave in her affliction, and to ask her forgiveness for her breach of friendship, and with a pious discourse to encourage her. So that, after all, to suppose that Mrs. Bargrave could hatch such an invention as this from Friday noon to Saturday noon, supposing that she knew of Mrs. Veal's death the very first moment, without jumbling circumstances, and without any interest too, she must be more witty, fortunate, and wicked too, than any indifferent person, I dare say, will allow. I asked Mrs. Bargrave several times if she was sure she felt the gown. She answered modestly, "If my senses be to be relied on, I am sure of it." I asked her if she heard a sound when she clapped her hand upon her knee. She said she did not remember she did, but said she appeared to be as much a substance as I did who talked with her. "And I may," said she, "be as soon persuaded that your apparition is talking to me now as that I did not really see her, for I was under no manner of fear, and received her as a friend, and parted with her as such. I would not," says she, "give 1 farthing to make anyone believe it. I have no interest in it. Nothing but trouble is entailed upon me for a long time, for aught I know, and had it not come to light by accident, it would never have been made public." But now she says she will make her own private use of it, and keep herself out of the way as much as she can, and so she has done since. She says she had a gentleman who came 30 miles to her to hear the relation, and that she had told it to a roomful of people at the time. Several particular gentlemen have had the story from Mrs. Bargrave's own mouth. This thing has very much affected me, and I am as well satisfied as I am of the best grounded matter of fact. And why we should dispute matter of fact because we cannot solve things of which we can have no certain or demonstrative actions, seems strange to me. Mrs. Bargrave's authority and sincerity alone would have been undoubted in any other case. The end. Blimey, that was a wordy one. Yes. Many words. Was slightly tripping up over them. But about... What's the time? Let's... Thank you. Yes, I feel like Defoe could have broken down some of those sentences just a smidge. There were lots of run on, tripping up just reading them in your head. I'm impressed. I know, lots of run on sentences there. Oh, excuse me. But I reckon we can fit in another one before break time. So let's continue with my boy Dickens. We've got all the nice short snappy titles today. So this is The Old Man's Tale of the Queer Client from the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. "It matters little," said the old man, "where or how I picked up this brief history. If I were to relate it in the order in which it reached me, I should commence in the middle, and when I had arrived at the conclusion, go back for a beginning. It is enough for me to say that some of its circumstances passed before my own eyes. For the remainder, I know them to have happened, and there are some persons yet living who will remember them but too well. In the Borough High Street, near St. George's Church, and on the same side of the way, stands, as most people know, the smallest of our debtors' prisons, the Marshalsea. Although in later times it has been a very different place from the sink of filth and dirt it once was, even its improved condition holds out but little temptation to the extravagant, or consolation to the provident. The condemned felon has as good a yard for air and exercise in Newgate as the insolvent debtor in the Marshalsea prison. It may be my fancy, or it may be that I cannot separate the place from the old recollections associated with it, but this part of London I cannot bear. The street is broad, the shops are spacious, the noise of passing vehicles, the footsteps of a perpetual stream of people, all the busy sounds of traffic resound in it from morn to midnight, but the streets around are mean and close. Poverty and debauchery lie festering in the crowded alleys. Want and misfortune are pent up in the narrow prison. An air of gloom and dreariness seems, in my eyes at least, to hang about the scene, and to impart to it a squalid and sickly hue. Many eyes that have long since been closed in the grave have looked round upon that scene lightly enough when entering the gate of the old Marshalsea prison for the first time, for despair seldom comes with the first severe shock of misfortune. A man has confidence in untried friends. He remembers the many offers of service so freely made by his boon companions when he wanted them not. He has hope, the hope of happy inexperience, and however he may bend beneath the first shock, it springs up in his bosom and flourishes there for a brief space until it droops beneath the blight of disappointment and neglect. How soon have those same eyes, deeply sunken in the head, glared from faces wasted with famine and sallow from confinement, in days when it was no figure of speech to say debtors rotted in prison, with no hope of release and no prospect of liberty. The atrocity in its full extent no longer exists, but there is enough of it left to give rise to occurrences that make the heart bleed. 20 years ago, that pavement was worn with the footsteps of a mother and child, who, day by day, so surely as the morning came, presented themselves at the prison gate. Often, after a night of restless misery and anxious thoughts, were they there, a full hour too soon, and then the young mother, turning meekly away, would lead the child to the old bridge, and raising him in her arms to show him the glistening water, tinted with the light of the morning sun, and stirring with all the bustling preparations for business and pleasure that the river presented at that early hour, endeavour to interest his thoughts in the objects before him. But she would quickly set him down, and hiding her face in her shawl, give vent to the tears that blinded her. For no expression of interest or amusement lighted up his thin and sickly face. His recollections were few enough, but they were all of one kind, all connected with the poverty and misery of his parents. Hour after hour had he sat on his mother's knee, and with childish sympathy watched the tears that stole down her face, and then crept quietly away into some dark corner and sobbed himself to sleep. The hard realities of the world, with many of its worst privations, hunger and thirst and cold and want, had all come home to him from the first dawnings of reason, and though the form of childhood was there, in its light heart, its merry eyes, its light heart, its merry laugh and sparkling eyes were wanting. The father and mother looked on upon this, and upon each other, with thoughts of agony they dared not breathe in words. The healthy, strong-made man, who could have borne almost any fatigue of active exertion, was wasting beneath the close confinement and unhealthy atmosphere of a crowded prison. The slight and delicate woman was sinking beneath the combined effects of bodily and mental illness. The child's young heart was breaking. Winter came, and with it weeks of cold and heavy rain. The poor girl had removed to a wretched apartment close to the spot of her husband's imprisonment, and though the change had been rendered necessary by their increasing poverty, she was happier now, for she was nearer him. For 2 months she and her little companion watched the opening of the gate as usual. One day she failed to come for the first time. Another morning arrived, and she came alone. The child was dead. They little know who coldly talk of the poor man's bereavements as a happy release from pain to the departed and a merciful relief from expense to the survivor. They little know, I say, what the agony of those bereavements is. A silent look of affection and regard when all other eyes are turned coldly away, the consciousness that we possess the sympathy and affection of one being when all others have deserted us, is a hold, a stay, a comfort in the deepest affliction which no wealth could purchase or power bestow. The child had sat at his parents' feet for hours together, with his little hands patiently folded in each other, and his thin, wan face raised towards them. They had seen him pine away from day to day, and though his brief existence had been a joyless one, and he was now removed to that peace and rest which, child as he was, he had never known in this world. They were his parents, and his loss sunk deep into their souls. It was plain to those who looked upon the mother's altered face that death must soon close the scene of her adversity and trial. Her husband's fellow prisoners shrank from obtruding on his grief and misery, and left to himself alone the small room he had previously occupied in common with 2 companions. She shared it with him, and, lingering on without pain but without hope, her life ebbed slowly away. She had fainted one evening in her husband's arms, and he had borne her to the open window to revive her with the air, when the light of the moon falling full upon her face showed him a change upon her features, which made him stagger beneath her weight, like a helpless infant. "Set me down, George," she said faintly. He did so, and seating himself beside her, covered his face with his hands and burst into tears. "It is very hard to leave you, George," she said, "but it is God's will, and you must bear it for my sake. Oh, how I thank him for having taken our boy. He is happy and in heaven now. What would he have done here without his mother?" "You shall not die, Mary, you shall not die," said the husband, starting up. He paced hurriedly to and fro, striking his head with his clenched fists, then reseating himself beside her and supporting her in his arms, added more calmly, "Rouse myself, my dear. Pray, pray do. You will revive yet." "Never again, George, never again," said the dying woman. "Let them lay me by my poor boy now, but promise me that if ever you leave this dreadful place and should grow rich, you will have us removed to some quiet country churchyard, a long, long way off, very far from here, where we can rest in peace. Dear George, promise me you will." I do, said the man, throwing himself passionately on his knees before her. "Speak to me, Mary. Another word. One look, but one." He ceased to speak, for the arm that clasped his neck grew stiff and heavy. A deep sigh escaped from the wasted form before him. The lips moved, and a smile played upon the face. But the lips were pallid, and the smile faded into a rigid and ghastly stare. He was alone in the world. That night, in the silence and desolation of his miserable room, the wretched man knelt down by the dead body of his wife and called on God to witness a terrible oath, that from that hour he devoted himself to revenge her death and that of his child, that thenceforth to the last moment of his life his whole energies should be directed to this one object, that his revenge should be protracted and terrible, that his hatred should be undying and inextinguishable, and should hunt its object through the world. The deepest despair and passions scarcely human had made such fierce ravages on his face and form in that one night that his companions in misfortune shrunk affrighted from him as he passed by. His eyes were bloodshot and heavy, his face a deadly white, and his body bent as if with age. He had bitten his underlip nearly through in the violence of his mental suffering, and the blood which had flowed from the wound had trickled down his chin and stained his shirt and neckerchief. No tear or sound of complaint escaped him, but the unsettled look and disordered haste with which he paced up and down the yard denoted the fever which was burning within. It was necessary that his wife's body should be removed from the prison without delay. He received the communication with perfect calmness and acquiesced in its propriety. Nearly all the inmates of the prison had assembled to witness its removal. They fell back on either side when the widower appeared. He walked hurriedly forward and stationed himself alone in a little railed area close to the lodge gate, from whence the crowd, with an instinctive feeling of delicacy, had retired. The rude coffin was borne slowly forward on men's shoulders. A dead silence pervaded the throng, broken only by the audible lamentations of the women and the shuffling steps of the bearers on the stone pavement. They reached the spot where the bereaved husband stood, and stopped. He laid his hand upon the coffin, and mechanically adjusting the pall with which it was covered, motioned them onward. The turnkeys in the prison lobby took off their hats as it passed through, and in another moment the heavy gate closed behind it. He looked vacantly upon the crowd, and fell heavily to the ground. Although for many weeks after this he was watched night and day in the wildest ravings of fever, neither the consciousness of his loss nor the recollection of the vow he had made ever left him for a moment. Scenes changed before his eyes, place succeeded place, and event followed event, in all the hurry of delirium, but they were all connected in some way with the great object of his mind. He was sailing over a boundless expanse of sea, with a blood-red sky above, and the angry waters lashed into fury beneath, boiling and eddying up on every side. There was another vessel before them, toiling and labouring in the howling storm, her canvas fluttering in ribbons from the mast, and her deck thronged with figures who were lashed to the sides, over which huge waves every instant burst, sweeping away some devoted creatures into the foaming sea. Onward they bore, amidst the roaring mass of water, with a speed and force which nothing could resist, and striking the stern of the foremost vessel, crushed her beneath their keel. From the huge whirlpool which the sinking wreck occasioned arose a shriek so loud and shrill, the death cry of 100 drowning creatures blended into one fierce yell, that it rung far above the war cry of the elements, and echoed and re-echoed till it seemed to pierce air, sky, and ocean. But what was that? That old grey head that rose above the water's surface, and with looks of agony and screams for aid buffeted with the waves. One look, and he had sprung from the vessel's side, and with vigorous strokes was swimming towards it. He reached it. He was close upon it. They were his features. The old man saw him coming, and vainly strove to elude his grasp. But he clasped him tight and dragged him beneath the water. Down, down with him, 50 fathoms down. His struggles grew fainter and fainter, until they wholly ceased. He was dead. He had killed him, and had kept his oath. He was traversing the scorching sands of a mighty desert, barefooted and alone. The sand choked and blinded him. Its fine, thin grains entered the very pores of his skin and irritated him almost to madness. Gigantic masses of the same material, carried forward by the wind and shone through by the burning sun, stalked in the distance like pillars of living fire. The bones of men who had perished in the dreary waste lay scattered at his feet. A fearful light fell on everything around, so far as the eye could reach. Nothing but objects of dread and horror presented themselves. Vainly striving to utter a cry of terror, with his tongue cleaving to his mouth, he rushed madly forward. Armed with supernatural strength, he waded through the sand until, exhausted with fatigue and thirst, he fell senseless on the earth. What fragrant coolness revived him? What gushing sound was that? Water. It was indeed a well, and the clear, fresh stream was running at his feet. He drank deeply of it, and throwing his aching limbs upon the bank, sank into a delicious trance. The sound of approaching footsteps aroused him. An old grey-headed man tottered forward to slake his burning thirst. It was he again. He wound his arms round the old man's body and held him back. He struggled and shrieked for water, but for one drop of water to save his life. But he held the old man firmly and watched his agonies, with greedy eyes, and when his lifeless head fell forward on his bosom, he rolled the corpse from him with his feet. When the fever left him and consciousness returned, he awoke to find himself rich and free, to hear that the parent who would have let him die in jail who had let those who were far dearer to him than his own existence die of want and sickness of heart that medicine cannot cure, had been found dead on his bed of down. He had had all the heart to leave his son a beggar, but proud even of his health and strength, had put off the act till it was too late, and now might gnash his teeth in the other world at the thought of the wealth his remisses had left him. He woke to this, and he awoke to more. To recollect the purpose for which he lived, and to remember that his enemy was his wife's own father, the man who had cast him into prison, and who, when his daughter and her child sued at his feet for mercy, had spurned them from his door. Oh, how he cursed the weakness that prevented him from being up and active in his scheme of vengeance. He caused himself to be carried from the scene of his loss and misery, and conveyed to a quiet residence on the sea coast, not in the hope of recovering his peace of mind or happiness, for both were fled forever, but to restore his prostrate energies and meditate on his darling object. And here some evil spirit cast in his way the opportunity for his first, most horrible revenge. It was summer-time, and wrapped in his gloomy thoughts, he would issue from his solitary lodgings early in the evening, and wandering along a narrow path beneath the cliffs to a wild and lonely spot that had struck his fancy in his ramblings, seat himself on some fallen fragment of the rock, and burying his face in his hands, remain there for hours, sometimes until night had completely closed in, and the long shadows of the frowning cliffs above his head cast a thick black darkness on every object near him. He was seated here, one calm evening, in his old position, now and then raising his head to watch the flight of a seagull, or carry his eye along the glorious crimson path, which, commencing in the middle of the ocean, seemed to lead to its very verge where the sun was setting, when the profound stillness of the spot was broken by a loud cry for help. He listened, doubtful of his having heard aright, when the cry was repeated with even greater vehemence than before, and starting to his feet, he hastened in the direction whence it proceeded. The tale told itself at once. Some scattered garments lay on the beach. A human head was just visible above the waves at a little distance from the shore, and an old man, wringing his hands in agony, was running to and fro, shrieking for assistance. The invalid, whose strength was now sufficiently restored, threw off his coat and rushed towards the sea with the intention of plunging in and dragging the drowning man ashore. "Hasten here, sir, in God's name! Help! Help, sir, for the love of heaven! He is my son, sir, my only son!" said the old man, frantically as he advanced to meet him. "My only son, sir, and he is dying before his father's eyes." At the first word the old man uttered, the stranger checked himself in his career, and, folding his arms, stood perfectly motionless. "Great God!" exclaimed the old man, recoiling. "Hailing!" The stranger smiled, and was silent. "Hailing!" said the old man wildly. My boy! Hailing! My dear boy! Look! Look!" Gasping for breath, the miserable father pointed to the spot where the young man was struggling for life. "Hark!" said the old man. "He cries once more. He is alive yet. Hailing, save him! Save him!" The stranger smiled again, and remained immovable as a statue. "I have wronged you," shrieked the old man, falling on his knees and clasping his hands together. "Be revenged, take my all, my life, cast me into the water at your feet, and if human nature can repress a struggle, I will die without stirring hand or foot. Do it, Hailing, do it, but save my boy, he is so young. Hailing, so young to die." "Listen," said the stranger, grasping the old man fiercely by the wrist. "I will have life for life, and here in one. My child died before his father's eyes, a far more agonizing and painful death than that young slanderer of his sister's worth is meeting while I speak. You laughed in your daughter's face, where death had already set his hand, at our sufferings then. What do you think of them now? See there, see there!" As the stranger spoke, he pointed to the sea. A faint cry died away upon its surface. The last powerful struggle of the dying man agitated the rippling waves for a few seconds, and the spot where he had gone down into his early grave was indistinguishable from the surrounding water. 3 years had elapsed when a gentleman alighted from a private carriage at the door of a London attorney, then well known as a man of no great nicety in his professional dealings, and requested a private interview on business of importance. Although evidently not past the prime of life, his face was pale, haggard, and dejected, and it did not require the acute perception of the man of business to discern at a glance that disease or suffering had done more to work a change in his appearance than the mere hand of time could have accomplished in twice the period of his whole life. "I wish you to undertake some legal business for me," said the stranger. The attorney bowed obsequiously and glanced at a larger packet which the gentleman carried in his hand. His visitor observed the look and proceeded. "It is no common business," said he, "nor have these papers reached my hands without long trouble and great expense." The attorney cast a still more anxious look at the packet, and his visitor, untying the string that bound it, disclosed a quantity of promissory note, with copies of deeds and other documents. "Upon these papers," said the client, "the man whose name they bear has raised, as you will see, large sums of money for some years past. There was a tacit understanding between him and the men into whose hands they originally went, and from whom I have by degrees purchased the whole, for treble and quadruple their nominal value, that these loans should be from time to time renewed, until a given period had elapsed. Such an understanding is nowhere expressed. He has sustained many losses of late, and these obligations accumulating upon him at once would crush him to the earth." "The whole amount is many thousands of pounds," said the attorney, looking over the papers. "It is," said the client. "What are we to do?" inquired the man of business. "Do?" replied the client, with sudden vehemence. "Put every engine of the law in force, every trick that ingenuity can devise and rascality execute, fair means and foul, the open oppression of the law, aided by all the craft of its most ingenious practitioners. I would have him die a harassing and lingering death. Ruin him, seize and sell his lands and goods, drive him from house and home, and drag him forth a beggar in his old age, to die in a common jail." "But the costs, my dear sir, the costs of all this," reasoned the attorney when he had recovered from his momentary surprise. "If the defendant be a man of straw, who is to pay the costs, sir?" "Name any sum," said the stranger, his hand trembling so violently with excitement that he could scarcely hold the pen he seized as he spoke. "Any sum, and it is yours. Don't be afraid to name it, man. I shall not think it dear if you gain my object." The attorney named a large sum at hazard, as the advance he should require to secure himself against the possibility of loss, but more with the view of ascertaining how far his client was really disposed to go than with any idea that he would comply with the demand. The stranger wrote a cheque upon his banker for the whole amount, and left him. The draft was duly honoured, and the attorney, finding that his strange client might be safely relied upon, commenced his work in earnest. For more than 2 years afterwards, Mr. Hayling would sit whole days together in the office, poring over the papers as they accumulated, and reading again and again, his eyes gleaming with joy, the letters of remonstrance, the prayers for a little delay, the representations of the certain ruin in which the opposite party must be involved, which poured in as suit after suit and process after process was commenced. To all applications for a brief indulgence there was but one reply: the money must be paid. Land, house, furniture, each in its turn, was taken under some one of the numerous executions which were issued, and the old man himself would have been immured in prison had he not escaped the vigilance of the officers and fled. The implacable animosity of Hayling, so far from being satiated by the success of his persecution, increased 100-fold with the ruin he inflicted. On being informed of the old man's flight, his fury was unbounded. He gnashed his teeth with rage, tore the hair from his head, and assailed with horrid imprecations the men who had been entrusted with the writ. He was only restored to comparative calmness by repeated assurances of the certainty of discovering the fugitive. Agents were sent in quest of him in all directions. Every stratagem that could be invented was resorted to for the purpose of discovering his place of retreat, but it was all in vain. Half a year had passed over, and he was still undiscovered. At length, late one night, Hayling, of whom nothing had been seen for many weeks before, appeared at his attorney's private residence and set up word that a gentleman wished to see him instantly. Before the attorney, who had recognised his voice from above stairs, could order the servant to admit him, he had rushed up the staircase and entered the drawing-room, pale and breathless. Having closed the door to prevent being overheard, he sank into a chair and said in a low voice, "Hush, I have found him at last." "No," said the attorney. "Well done, my dear sir, well done." "He lies concealed in a wretched lodging in Camden Town," said Hayling. "Perhaps it is as well we did lose sight of him, for he has been living alone there in the most abject misery all the time, and he is poor, very poor." "Very good," said the attorney. "You will have the capture made tomorrow, of course?" "Yes," replied Hayling. "Stay, no, the next day. You are surprised at my wishing to postpone it," he added with a ghastly smile, "but I had forgotten. The next day is an anniversary in his life. Let it be done then." "Very good," said the attorney. "Will you write down instructions for the officer?" "No. Let him meet me here at 8 in the evening, and I will accompany him myself." They met on the appointed night, and hiring a hackney coach, directed the driver to stop at that corner of the old Pancras Road, at which stands the parish workhouse. By the time they alighted there, it was quite dark, and proceeding by the dead wall in front of the veterinary hospital, they entered by a small by-street, which is, or was at that time, called Little College Street, and which, whatever it may be now, was in those days a desolate place enough, surrounded by little else than fields and ditches. Having drawn the travelling cap he had on half over his face and muffled himself in his cloak, Hayling stopped before the meanest looking house in the street, and knocked gently at the door. It was at once opened by a woman, who dropped a curtsy of recognition, and Hayling, whispering the officer to remain below, crept gently upstairs, and opening the door of the front room, entered at once. The object of his search and his unrelenting animosity, now a decrepit old man, was seated at a bare deal table, on which stood a miserable candle. He started on the entrance of the stranger and rose feebly to his feet. "What now? What now?" said the old man. "What fresh misery is this? What do you want here?" "A word with you," replied Hayling. As he spoke, he seated himself at the other end of the table, and throwing off his cloak and cap, disclosed his features. The old man seemed instantly deprived of the power of speech. He fell backward in his chair, and clasping his hands together, gazed on the apparition with a mingled look of abhorrence and fear. "This day 6 years," said Hayling, "I claimed the life you owed me for my child's. Beside the lifeless form of your daughter, old man, I swore to live a life of revenge. I have never swerved from my purpose for a moment's space, but if I had, one thought of her uncomplaining, suffering look as she drooped away, or of the starving face of our innocent child, would have nerved me to my task. My first act of requital you well remember. This is my last." The old man shivered, and his hands dropped powerless by his side. "I leave England tomorrow," said Hayling, after a moment's pause. "Tonight I consign you to the living death to which you devoted her, a hopeless prison." He raised his eyes to the old man's countenance, and paused. He lifted the light to his face, set it gently down, and left the apartment. "You had better see to the old man," he said to the woman as he opened the door and motioned the officer to follow him into the street. "I think he is ill." The woman closed the door, ran hastily upstairs, and found him lifeless. Beneath a plain gravestone, in one of the most peaceful and secluded churchyards in Kent, where wild flowers mingle with the grass and the soft landscape around forms the fairest spot in the garden of England, lie the bones of the young mother and her gentle child. But the ashes of the father do not mingle with theirs, nor from that night forward did the attorney ever gain the remotest clue to the subsequent history of his queer client. The end. I hope you enjoyed that one. It was very Edmond Dantes, and I realised whilst reading it, I have read this before on stream. Whoops! So apologies for those of you who have heard this before. I believe it is actually on the archive of our streams on YouTube. I realised halfway through reading it. Yeah, really. So apologies for that, but I guess you get it twice. So when we put this up on YouTube, what I might do is either ask Sam to edit this one out or ask him to send me the thing and I'll edit it out myself. But anyway, let us go to a break. Bonus performance, exactly. It's a good story. Again, we like our revenge. And also, yeah, woo! Revenge against people who put people in debtors' prisons. There you go. Definitely worth a second read. Indeed. Also, hello Zilia. Hope you are well. Right, yes, let us go to a break. So, don't think there's any great problem with having it on there again? Yeah, I guess not. Easier for us, I suppose. Yes. Let's go to a break. So go do break-related things, and we shall see you back in about 5 minutes. Bye for now. also, yeah, reading books and realising you've read them before. That's not really something I find... she says, having just done it. That's not something I find myself doing that much. But, yeah. I think I must have done it, as you were just saying, Ray Tracer, like watching a film and realising you've read the book of it. Pretty sure I've done that before. I don't think I've read a book twice, accidentally. Not sure I've done that. But yes. Also, I just looked up Wilkie Collins, who's the next author we're reading, and he wrote The Moonstone, which is another one that I kind of want to read, as not a short story, obviously, a longer book. And The Woman in White. I knew I recognised him for a reason. Woman in White is Wilkie Collins, which, yes, allegedly is another good one to read. But that's such a good one. Yeah, I need to read some Wilkie Collins, definitely. You found a collection of his ghost stories. Yeah, he's written a lot of good stuff. When you get on a kick reading a lot of kind of formulaic genre fiction, I can't read today. Romance, it tends to be an issue. Yeah, looks like he's got a few we might be interested in. Indeed, yes. He's definitely been a name that I keep on meaning to put like on our list of people to check out. But yes. So let us continue then with possibly my favourite title of tonight. Let me take a sip of water. A Terribly Strange Bed by Wilkie Collins. Shortly after my education at college was finished, I happened to be staying at Paris with an English friend. We were both young men then, and lived, I am afraid, rather a wild life in the delightful city of our sojourn. One night we were idling about the neighbourhood of the Palais Royal, doubtful to what amusement we should next betake ourselves. My friend proposed a visit to Frascati's, but his suggestion was not to my taste. I knew Frascati's, as the French saying is, by heart, had lost and won plenty of 5-franc pieces there, merely for amusement's sake, until it was amusement no longer, and was thoroughly tired, in fact, of all the ghastly respectabilities of such a social anomaly as a respectable gambling house. "For heaven's sake," said I to my friend, "let us go somewhere where we can see a little genuine poverty-stricken gambling with no false gingerbread glitter thrown over it all. Let us get away from fashionable Frascati's to a house where they don't mind letting in a man with a ragged coat, or a man with no coat, ragged or otherwise." "Very well," said my friend. "We needn't go out of the Palais Royal to find the sort of company you want. Here's the place just before us. As bad a place by all report as you could possibly wish to see." In another minute we arrived at the door and entered the house. When we got upstairs and had left our hats and sticks with the doorkeeper, we were admitted into the chief gambling room. We did not find many people assembled there, but few as the men were who looked up at us on our entrance, they were all types, lamentably true types of their respective classes. We had come to see blackguards, but these men were something worse. There is a comic side, more or less appreciable, in all blackguardism. Here there was nothing but tragedy. Mute, strange tragedy. The quiet in the room was horrible. The thin, haggard, long-haired young man, whose sunken eyes fiercely watched the turning up of the cards, never spoke. The flabby, fat-faced, pimply player, who pricked his piece of pasteboard perseveringly to register how often black won and how often red, never spoke. The dirty, wrinkled old man with the vulture eyes and the darned greatcoat, who had lost his last sou and still looked on desperately after he could play no longer, never spoke. Even the voice of the croupier sounded as if it was strangely dulled and thickened in the atmosphere of the room. I had entered the place to laugh, but the spectacle before me was something to weep over. I soon found it necessary to take refuge in excitement from the depression of spirits which was stealing on me. Unfortunately, I sought the nearest excitement by going to the table and beginning to play. Still more unfortunately, as the event will show, I won. Won prodigiously, won incredibly, won at such a rate that the regular players at the table crowded round me and, staring at my stakes with hungry, superstitious eyes, whispered to one another that the English stranger was going to break the bank. The game was rouge et noir. I had played at it in every city in Europe, without, however, the care or the wish to study the theory of chances, that philosopher's stone of all gamblers. And a gambler, in the strict sense of the word, I had never been. I was heart-whole from the corroding passion for play. My gaming was a mere idle amusement. I never resorted to it by necessity, because I never knew what it was to want money. I never practised it so incessantly as to lose more than I could afford, or to gain more than I could coolly pocket without being thrown off my balance by my good luck. In short, I had hitherto frequented gambling tables just as I frequented ballrooms and opera houses, because they amused me, and because I had nothing better to do with my leisure hours. But on this occasion it was very different. Now, for the first time in my life, I felt what the passion for play really was. My successes first bewildered, and then, in the most literal meaning of the word, intoxicated me. Incredible as it may appear, it is nevertheless true that I only lost when I attempted to estimate chances and played according to previous calculation. If I left everything to luck and staked without any care or consideration, I was sure to win in the face of every recognised probability in favour of the bank. At first, some of the men present ventured their money safely enough on my colour, but I speedily increased my stakes to sums which they dared not risk. One after another they left off playing, and breathlessly looked on at my game. Still, time after time, I staked higher and higher, and still won. The excitement in the room rose to fever pitch. The silence was interrupted by a deep muttered chorus of oaths and exclamations in different languages. Every time the gold was shoveled across to my side of the table, even the imperturbable croupier dashed his rake on the floor in a French fury of astonishment at my success. But one man present preserved his self-possession, and that man was my friend. He came to my side, and, whispering in English, begged me to leave the place, satisfied with what I had already gained. I must do him the justice to say that he repeated his warnings and entreaties several times, and only left me and went away after I had rejected his advice. I was to all intents and purposes gambling drunk, in terms which rendered it impossible for him to address me again that night. Shortly after he had gone, a hoarse voice behind me cried, "Permit me, my dear sir, permit me to restore to their proper place 2 Napoleons which you have dropped. Wonderful luck, sir. I pledge you my word of honour as an old soldier, in the course of my long experience in this sort of thing, I never saw such luck as yours. Never. Go on, sir. Sacre mille bombes. Go on boldly and break the bank." I turned around and saw, nodding and smiling at me with inveterate civility, a tall man, dressed in a frogged and braided surtout. If I had been in my senses, I should have considered him personally as being rather a suspicious specimen of an old soldier. He had goggling, bloodshot eyes, mangy moustaches, and a broken nose. His voice betrayed a barrack-room intonation of the worst order, and he had the dirtiest pair of hands I ever saw, even in France. These little personal peculiarities exercised, however, no repelling influence on me. In the mad excitement, the reckless triumph of that moment, I was ready to fraternise with anybody who encouraged me in my game. I accepted the old soldier's offered pinch of snuff, clapped him on the back, and swore he was the honestest fellow in the world, the most glorious relic of the Grand Army that I had ever met. "Go on!" cried my military friend, snapping his fingers in ecstasy. "Go on and win! Break the bank! Mille tonnerres, my gallant English comrade, break the bank!" And I did go on. Went on at such a rate that in another quarter of an hour the croupier called out, "Gentlemen, the bank has discontinued for tonight." All the notes and all the gold in that bank now lay in a heap under my hands. The whole floating capital of the gambling house was waiting to pour into my pockets. "Tie up the money in your pocket-handkerchief, my worthy sir," said the old soldier, as I wildly plunged my hands into my heap of gold. "Tie it up, as we used to tie up a bit of dinner in the Grand Army. Your winnings are too heavy for any breeches pockets that ever were sewed. There, that's it, shovel them in, notes and all. Crédit, what luck! Stop, oh, another Napoleon on the floor. Ah, sacre petit polisson de Napoleon, have I found thee at last? Now then, sir, 2 tight double knots each way with your honourable permission, and the money's safe. Feel it, fortunate sir, hard and round as a cannonball. A bass, if they had only fired such cannonballs at us at Austerlitz. Nom d'une pipe, if they only had. And now, as an ancient grenadier, as an ex-brave of the French army, what remains for me to do? I ask what? Simply this, to entreat my valued English friend to drink a bottle of champagne with me, and toast the goddess Fortune in foaming goblets before we part. Excellent ex-brave, convivial ancient grenadier, champagne by all means, an English cheer for an old soldier. Hurrah, hurrah, another English cheer for the goddess Fortune. Hurrah, hurrah. Bravo, the Englishman, the amiable, gracious Englishman in whose veins circulates the vivacious blood of France. Another glass? A bass? The bottle is empty. Never mind. Vive le vin! I, the old soldier, order another bottle, and half a pound of bonbons with it. No, no, ex-brave, never, ancient grenadier. Your bottle last time, my bottle this. Behold it. Toast away. The French army, the great Napoleon, the present company, the croupier, the honest croupier's wife and daughters, if he has any, the ladies generally, everybody in the world. By the time the second bottle of champagne was emptied, I felt as if I had been drinking liquid fire. My brain seemed all aflame. No excess in wine had ever had this effect upon me before in my life. Was it the result of a stimulant acting upon my system when I was in a highly excited state? Was my stomach in a particularly disordered condition? Or was the champagne amazingly strong? Ex-brave of the French army, cried I in a mad state of exhilaration, I am on fire. How are you? You have set me on fire. Do you hear, my hero of Austerlitz? Let us have a third bottle of champagne to put the flame out. The old soldier wagged his head, rolled his goggle eyes, until I expected to see them slip out of their sockets, placed his dirty forefinger by the side of his broken nose, solemnly exclaimed, "Coffee!" and immediately ran off into an inner room. The word pronounced by the eccentric veteran seemed to have a magical effect on the rest of the company present. With one accord they all rose to depart. Probably they had expected to profit by my intoxication, but finding that my new friend was benevolently bent on preventing me from getting dead drunk, had now abandoned all hope of thriving pleasantly on my winnings. Whatever their motive might be, at any rate they went away in a body. When the old soldier returned and sat down again opposite to me at the table, we had the room to ourselves. I could see the croupier in a sort of vestibule which opened out of it, eating his supper in solitude. The silence was now deeper than ever. A sudden change, too, had come over the ex-brave. He assumed a portentously solemn look, and when he spoke to me again, his speech was ornamented by no oaths, enforced by no finger-snapping, enlivened by no apostrophes or exclamations. "Listen, my dear sir," said he, in mysteriously confidential tones. "Listen to an old soldier's advice. I have been to the mistress of the house, a very charming woman with a genius for cookery, to impress on the necessity of making us some particularly strong and good coffee. You must drink this coffee in order to get rid of your little amiable exaltation of spirits before you think of going home. You must, my good and gracious friend. With all that money to take home tonight, it is a sacred duty to yourself to have your wits about you. You are known to be a winner to an enormous extent by several gentlemen present tonight who, in a certain point of view, are very worthy and excellent fellows, but they are mortal men, my dear sir, and they have their amiable weaknesses. Need I say more? No, you understand me. Now, this is what you must do. Send for a cabriolet when you feel quite well again, draw up all the windows when you get into it, and tell the driver to take you home only through the large and well-lighted thoroughfares. Do this, and you and your money will be safe. Do this, and tomorrow you will thank an old soldier for giving you a word of honest advice." Just as the ex-brave ended his oration in very lachrymose tones, the coffee came in, ready poured out in 2 cups. My attentive friend handed me one of the cups with a bow. I was parched with thirst and drank it off at a draught. Almost instantly afterward I was seized with a fit of giddiness and felt more completely intoxicated than ever. The room whirled round and round furiously. The old soldier seemed to be regularly bobbing up and down before me like the piston of a steam engine. I was half deafened by a violent singing in my ears. A feeling of utter bewilderment, helplessness, idiocy overcame me. I rose from my chair, holding on by the table to keep my balance, and stammered out that I felt dreadfully unwell, so unwell that I did not know how I was to get home. "My dear friend," answered the old soldier, and even his voice seemed to be bobbing up and down as he spoke. "My dear friend, it would be madness to go home in your state. You would be sure to lose your money. You might be robbed and murdered with the greatest ease. I am going to sleep here. Do you sleep here too. They make up capital beds in this house. Take one, sleep off the effects of the wine, and go home safely with your winnings tomorrow. Tomorrow in broad daylight." I had but 2 ideas left. One, that I must never let go hold of my handkerchief full of money. The other, that I must lie down somewhere immediately and fall off into a comfortable sleep. So I agreed to the proposal about the bed, and took the offered arm of the old soldier, carrying my money with my disengaged hand. Preceded by the croupier, we passed along some passages and up a flight of stairs into the bedroom which I was to occupy. The ex-brave shook me warmly by the hand, proposed that we should breakfast together, and then, followed by the croupier, left me for the night. I ran to the washstand, drank some of the water in my jug, poured the rest out, and plunged my face into it, then sat down in a chair and tried to compose myself. I soon felt better. The change for my lungs, from the fetid atmosphere of the gambling house to the cool air of the apartment I now occupied, the almost equally refreshing change for my eyes, from the glaring gaslights of the salon to the dim, quiet flicker of one bedroom candle, aided wonderfully the restorative effects of cold water. The giddiness left me, and I began to feel a little like a reasonable being again. My first thought was of the risk of sleeping all night in a gambling house. My second of the still greater risk of trying to get out after the house was closed, and of going home alone at night through the streets of Paris with a large sum of money about me. I had slept in worse places than this on my travels, so I determined to lock, bolt, and barricade my door, and take my chance till the next morning. Accordingly, I secured myself against all intrusion, looked under the bed and into the cupboard, tied the fastening of the window, and then, satisfied that I had taken every proper precaution, pulled off my upper clothing, put my light, which was a dim one, on the hearth among a feathery litter of wood ashes, and got into bed, with the handkerchief full of money under my pillow. I soon felt not only that I could not go to sleep, but that I could not even close my eyes. I was wide awake, and in a high fever. Every nerve in my body trembled. Every one of my senses seemed to be preternaturally sharpened. I tossed and rolled, and tried every kind of position, and perseveringly sought out the cold corners of the bed, and all to no purpose. Now I thrust my arms over the clothes, now I poked them out under the clothes, now I violently shot my legs straight out down to the bottom of the bed, now I convulsively coiled them up as near my chin as they would go. Now I shook out my crumpled pillow, changed it to the cool side, patted it flat, and lay down quietly on my back. Now I fiercely doubled it in two, set it up on end, thrust it against the board of the bed, and tried a sitting posture. Every effort was in vain. I groaned with vexation as I felt that I was in for a sleepless night. What could I do? I had no book to read. And yet, unless I found out some method of diverting my mind, I felt certain that I was in the condition to imagine all sorts of horrors, to rack my brain with forebodings of every possible and impossible danger. In short, to pass the night in suffering all conceivable varieties of nervous terror. I raised myself on my elbow and looked about the room, which was brightened by a lovely moonlight pouring straight through the window, to see if it contained any pictures or ornaments that I could at all clearly distinguish. While my eyes wandered from wall to wall, a remembrance of Le Maistre's delightful little book, Voyage autour de ma chambre, occurred to me. I resolved to imitate the French author and find occupation and amusement enough to relieve the tedium of my wakefulness by making a mental inventory of every article of furniture I could see, and by following up to their sources the multitude of associations which even a chair, a table, or a washstand may be made to call forth. In the nervous, unsettled state of my mind at that moment, I found it much easier to make my inventory than to make my reflections, and thereupon soon gave up all hope of thinking in Le Maistre's fanciful track, or, indeed, of thinking at all. I looked about the room at the different articles of furniture, and did nothing more. There was, first, the bed I was lying in, a four-poster bed, of all things in the world to meet with in Paris. Yes, a thorough, clumsy British four-poster, with a regular top lined with chintz, the regular fringed valance all round, the regular stifling, unwholesome curtains, which I remembered having mechanically drawn back against the posts, without particularly noticing the bed when I first got into the room. Then there was the marble-topped wash-hand stand, from which the water I had spilled, in my hurry to pour it out, was still dripping, slowly and more slowly, onto the brick floor. Then 2 small chairs, with my coat, waistcoat, and trousers flung on them. Then a large elbow chair covered with dirty white dimity, with my cravat and shirt collar thrown over the back. Then a chest of drawers with 2 of the brass handles off, and a tawdry broken china inkstand placed on it by way of ornament for the top. Then the dressing table, adorned by a very small looking-glass and a very large pincushion. Then the window, an unusually large window. Then a dark old picture, which the feeble candles dimly showed me. It was the picture of a fellow in a high Spanish hat, crowned with a plume of towering feathers. A swarthy, sinister ruffian, looking upward, shading his eyes with his hand, and looking intently upward. It might be at some tall gallows on which he was going to be hanged. At any rate, he had the appearance of thoroughly deserving it. This picture put a kind of constraint upon me to look upward too, at the top of the bed. It was a gloomy and not an interesting object, and I looked back at the picture. I counted the feathers in the man's hat. They stood out in relief. 3 white, 2 green. I observed the crown of his hat, which was of a conical shape, according to the fashion supposed to have been favoured by Guido Fawkes. I wondered what he was looking up at. It couldn't be at the stars. Such a desperado was neither astrologer nor astronomer. It must be at the high gallows, and he was going to be hanged presently. Would the executioner come into possession of his conical-crowned hat and plume of feathers? I counted the feathers again. 3 white, 2 green. While I still lingered over this very improving and intellectual employment, my thoughts insensibly began to wander. The moonlight shining into the room reminded me of a certain moonlight night in England, the night after a picnic party in a Welsh valley. Every incident of the drive homeward through lovely scenery, which the moonlight made lovelier than ever, came back to my remembrance. Though I had never given the picnic a thought for years, though if I had tried to recollect it, I could certainly have recalled little or nothing of that scene long past. Of all the wonderful faculties that help to tell us we are immortal, which speaks the sublime truth more eloquently than memory. Here was I, in a strange house of the most suspicious character, in a situation of uncertainty, and even of peril, which might seem to make the cool exercise of my recollection almost out of the question, nevertheless remembering, quite involuntarily, places, people, conversations, minute circumstances of every kind, which I had thought forgotten forever, which I could not possibly have recalled at will, even under the most favourable auspices. And what cause had produced in a moment the whole of this strange, complicated, mysterious effect? Nothing but some rays of moonlight shining in at my bedroom window. I was still thinking of the picnic, of our merriment on the drive home, of the sentimental young lady who would quote Childe Harold because it was moonlight. I was absorbed by these past scenes and past amusements when, in an instant, the thread on which my memories hung snapped asunder. My attention immediately came back to present things more vividly than ever, and I found myself, I neither knew why nor wherefore, looking hard at the picture again. Looking for what? Good God! The man had pulled his hat down on his brows. No, the hat itself was gone. Where was the conical crown? Where the feathers, 3 white, 2 green? Not there. In place of the hat and feathers, what dusky object was it that now hid his forehead, his eyes, his shading hand? Was the bed moving? I turned on my back and looked up. Was I mad, drunk, dreaming, giddy again? Or was the top of the bed really moving down, sinking slowly, regularly, silently, horribly, right down throughout the whole of its length and breadth, right down upon me as I lay underneath? My blood seemed to stand still. A deadly, paralysing coldness stole all over me as I turned my head round on the pillow and determined to test whether the bed top was really moving or not by keeping my eye on the man in the picture. The next look in that direction was enough. The dull, black, frowsy outline of the valance above me was within an inch of being parallel with his waist. I still looked breathlessly. And steadily and slowly, very slowly, I saw the figure and the line of frame below the figure vanish as the valance moved down before it. I am, constitutionally, anything but timid. I have been on more than one occasion in peril of my life, and have not lost my self-possession for an instant. But when the conviction first settled on my mind that the bed top really was moving, was steadily and continuously sinking down upon me, I looked up, shuddering, helpless, panic-stricken beneath the hideous machinery for murder, which was advancing closer and closer to suffocate me where I lay. I looked up, motionless, speechless, breathless. The candle, fully spent, went out, but the moonlight still brightened the room. Down and down, without pausing and without sounding, came the bed top, and still my panic terror seemed to bind me faster and faster to the mattress on which I lay. Down and down it sank, till the dusty odour from the lining of the canopy came stealing into my nostrils. At that final moment, the instinct of self-preservation startled me out of my trance, and I moved at last. There was just room for me to roll myself sideways of the bed. As I dropped noiselessly to the floor, the edge of the murderous canopy touched me on the shoulder. Without stopping to draw my breath, without wiping the cold sweat from my face, I rose instantly on my knees to watch the bed top. I was literally spellbound by it. If I had heard footsteps behind me, I could not have turned around. If a means of escape had been miraculously provided for me, I could not have moved to take advantage of it. The whole life in me was at that moment concentrated in my eyes. It descended. The whole canopy with the fringe round it came down, down, close down, so close that there was not room now to squeeze my finger between the bed top and the bed. I felt at the sides and discovered that what had appeared to me from beneath to be the ordinary light canopy of a four-poster bed was in reality a thick, broad mattress, the substance of which was concealed by the valance and its fringe. I looked up and saw the 4 posts rising hideously bare. In the middle of the bed top was a huge wooden screw that had evidently worked it down through a hole in the ceiling, just as ordinary presses are worked down on the substance selected for compression. The frightful apparatus moved without making the faintest noise. There had been no creaking as it came down. There was now not the faintest sound from the room above. Amidst a dead and awful silence, I beheld before me, in the 19th century and in the civilized capital of France, such a machine for secret murder by suffocation as might have existed in the worst days of the Inquisition, in the lonely inns among the Harz Mountains, in the mysterious tribunals of Westphalia. Still, as I looked on it, I could not move. I could hardly breathe. But I began to recover the power of thinking, and in a moment I discovered the murderous conspiracy framed against me in all its horror. My cup of coffee had been drugged, and drugged too strongly. I had been saved from being smothered by having taken an overdose of some narcotic. How I had chafed and fretted at the fever fit which had preserved my life by keeping me awake. How recklessly I had confided myself to the 2 wretches who had led me into this room, determined, for the sake of my winnings, to kill me in my sleep by the surest and most horrible contrivance for secretly accomplishing my destruction. How many men, winners like me, had slept, as I had proposed to sleep, in that bed, and had never been seen or heard of more. I shuddered at the bare idea of it. But ere long all thought was again suspended by the sight of the murderous canopy moving once more. After it had remained on the bed, as nearly as I could guess, about 10 minutes, it began to move up again. The villains who worked it from above evidently believed that their purpose was now accomplished. Slowly and silently, as it had descended, that horrible bed-top rose towards its former place. When it reached the upper extremities of the 4 posts, it reached the ceiling too. Neither hole nor screw could be seen. The bed became, in appearance, an ordinary bed again. The canopy an ordinary canopy, even to the most suspicious eyes. Now, for the first time, I was able to move, to rise from my knees, to dress myself in my upper clothing, and to consider of how I should escape. If I, betrayed by the smallest noise that the attempt to suffocate me had failed, I was certain to be murdered. Had I made any noise already? I listened intently, looking towards the door. No. No footsteps in the passage outside, no sound of a tread, light or heavy, in the room above. Absolute silence everywhere. Besides locking and bolting my door, I had moved an old wooden chest against it, which I had found under the bed. To remove this chest, my blood ran cold as I thought of what its contents might be, without making some disturbance was impossible. And moreover, to think of escaping through the house now barred up for the night was sheer insanity. Only one chance was left me, the window. I stole to it on tiptoe. My bedroom was on the 1st floor, above an entresol, and looked into the back street. I raised my hand to open the window, knowing that on that action hung, by the merest hairbreadth, my chance of safety. They keep vigilant watch in a house of murder. If any part of the frame creaked, if the hinge creaked, I was a lost man. It must have occupied me at least 5 minutes, reckoning by time, 5 hours reckoning by suspense, to open that window. I succeeded in doing it silently, in doing it with all the dexterity of a housebreaker, and then looked down into the street. To leap the distance beneath me would be almost certain destruction. Next, I looked round at the sides of the house. Down the left side ran a thick water pipe. It passed close by the outer edge of the window. The moment I saw the pipe, I knew I was saved. My breath came and went freely for the first time since I had seen the canopy of the bed moving down upon me. To some men, the means of escape which I had discovered might have seemed difficult and dangerous enough. To me, the prospect of slipping down the pipe into the street did not suggest even a thought of peril. I had always been accustomed, by the practice of gymnastics, to keep up my schoolboy powers as a daring and expert climber, and knew that my head, hands and feet would serve me faithfully in any hazards of ascent or descent. I had already got one leg over the window-sill when I remembered the handkerchief filled with money under my pillow. I could well have afforded to leave it behind me, but I was revengefully determined that the miscreants of the gambling house should miss their plunder as well as their victim. So I went back to the bed and tied the heavy handkerchief at my back by my cravat. Just as I had made it tight and fixed it in a comfortable place, I thought I heard a sound of breathing outside the door. The chill feeling of horror ran through me again as I listened. No. Dead silence still in the passage. I had only heard the night air blowing softly into the room. The next moment I was on the window-sill, and the next I had a firm grip on the water pipe with my hands and knees. I slid down into the street easily and quietly, as I thought I should, and immediately set off at the top of my speed to a branch prefecture of police, which I knew was situated in the immediate neighbourhood. A sub-prefect and several picked men among his subordinates happened to be up, maturing, I believe, some scheme for discovering the perpetrator of a mysterious murder which all Paris was talking of just then. When I began my story in a breathless hurry and in very bad French, I could see that the sub-prefect suspected me of being a drunken Englishman who had robbed somebody, but he soon altered his opinion as I went on, and before I had anything like concluded, he shoved all the papers before him into a drawer, put on his hat, supplied me with another, for I was bareheaded, ordered a file of soldiers, desired his expert followers to get ready all sorts of tools for breaking open doors and ripping up brick flooring, and took my arm, in the most friendly and familiar manner possible, to lead me with him out of the house. I will venture to say that when the sub-prefect was a little boy and was taken for the first time to the play, he was not half as much pleased as he was now at the job in prospect for him at the gambling house. Away we went through the streets, the sub-prefect cross-examining and congratulating me in the same breath as we marched at the head of our formidable postcomitatus. Sentinels were placed at the back and front of the house the moment we got to it. A tremendous battery of knocks was directed against the door. A light appeared at a window. I was told to conceal myself behind the police. Then came more knocks, and a cry of "Open in the name of the law!" At that terrible summons, bolts and locks gave way before an invisible hand, and the moment after the sub-prefect was in the passage, confronting a waiter half-dressed and ghastly pale. This was the short dialogue which immediately took place. "We want to see the Englishman who is sleeping in this house." He went away hours ago." "He did no such thing. His friend went away. He remained. Show us to his bedroom." I swear to you, monsieur le sous-préfet, he's not here. I swear to you, monsieur le garçon, he is. He slept here. He didn't find your bed comfortable. He came to us to complain of it. He is among my men, and here am I ready to look for a flea or two in his bedstead." "Renaudin," calling to one of his subordinates, and pointing to the waiter, "collar that man and tie his hands behind him. Now then, gentlemen, let us walk upstairs." Every man and woman in the house was secured, the old soldier the first. Then I identified the bed in which I had slept, and then we went into the room above. No object that was at all extraordinary appeared in any part of it. The sub-prefect looked round the place, commanded everybody to be silent, stamped twice on the floor, called for a candle, looked attentively at the spot he had stamped on, and ordered the flooring there to be carefully taken up. This was done in no time. Lights were produced, and we saw a deep, raftered cavity between the floor of this room and the ceiling of the room beneath. Through this cavity there ran perpendicularly a sort of case of iron, thickly greased, and inside the case appeared the screw which communicated with the bed top below. Extra lengths of screw, freshly oiled, levers covered with felt, all the complete upper works of a heavy press, constructed with infernal ingenuity so as to join the fixtures below, and when taken to pieces again to go into the smallest possible compass, were next discovered and pulled out onto the floor. After some little difficulty, the sub-prefect succeeded in putting the machinery together, and, leaving his men to work it, descended with me to the bedroom. The smothering canopy was then lowered, but not so noiselessly as I had seen it lowered. When I mentioned this to the sub-prefect, his answer, simple as it was, had a terrible significance. "My men," said he, "are working down the bed-top for the first time. The men whose money you won were in better practice." We left the house in the sole possession of 2 police agents, every one of the inmates being removed to prison on the spot. The sub-prefect, after taking down my procès-verbal in his office, returned with me to my hotel to get my passport. Do you think," I asked as I gave it to him, that any men have really been smothered in that bed, as they tried to smother me? I have seen dozens of drowned men laid out at the morgue, answered the sub-prefect, in whose pocket-books were found letters stating that they had committed suicide in the Seine because they had lost everything at the gaming table. Do I know how many of those men entered the same gambling house that you entered? Won as you won, took that bed as you took it, slept in it, were smothered in it, and were privately thrown in the river with a letter of explanation written by the murderers and placed in their pocket-books. No man can say how many or how few have suffered the fate from which you have escaped. The people of the gambling house kept their bedstead machinery a secret from us, even from the police. The dead kept the rest of the secret for them. Good night, or rather good morning, Monsieur Faulkner. Be at my office again at 9 o'clock. In the meantime, au revoir. The rest of my story is soon told. I was examined and re-examined. The gambling house was strictly searched all through from top to bottom. The prisoners were separately interrogated, and 2 of the less guilty among them made a confession. I discovered that the old soldier was the master of the gambling house. Justice discovered that he had been drummed out of the army as a vagabond years ago, that he had been guilty of all sorts of villainies since, that he was in possession of stolen property which the owners identified, that he, the croupier, another accomplice, and the woman who had made my cup of coffee were all in the secret of the bedstead. There appeared some reason to doubt whether the inferior persons attached to the house knew anything of the suffocating machinery, and they received the benefit of that doubt by being treated simply as thieves and vagabonds. As for the old soldier and his 2 head myrmidons, they went to the galleys. The woman who had drugged my coffee was imprisoned for I forget how many years. The regular attendants at the gambling house were considered suspicious and placed under surveillance, and I became, for 1 whole week, which was a long time, the head lion in Parisian society. My adventure was dramatised by 3 illustrious playmakers, but never saw theatrical daylight, for the censorship forbade the introduction on the stage of a correct copy of the gambling house bedstead. 1 good result was produced by my adventure, which any censorship must have approved. It cured me of ever again trying rouge et noir as an amusement. The sight of a green cloth with packs of cards and heaps of money on it will henceforth be forever associated in my mind with the sight of a bed canopy descending to suffocate me in the silence and darkness of the night. The end.